Now, the strange thing about this topic is, yes, it's alternate history, but the more I look into it, the more I get that line from Queen's song playing in my head. Is this real life? Is this just fantasy? Because there are so many reasons for them to have actually done it. It's scary. And you look at the other discussions they're having at the time, they come very close to actually doing it themselves at the time. So this is a very real possibility of what could have happened in the world. And honestly, the only reason they don't do it in the period prior to World War One, and I think they would have got around to it in about 1914, 1915, probably 1915 time, if World War One hadn't happened. I think these ships would have been ordered anyway. Is to try and save money, and because they still have the armoured cruisers and the Invincibles. So I'm going to explain this as I go through, because I think as a piece of alternate history, this is actually a very interesting thing to look into, because it looks at the reality of even when you are the most powerful nation on Earth, with, as far as the Navy is concerned, a blank check budget pretty much, there are limitations. Yes, you can demand more funding, but it's going to come at a political cost. So it's better to work with what you have than ask for more when you don't need it, or when you can't realistically justify it. And especially if you can push things down the road, you can let technologies mature, and you can maybe get a far better vessel in a couple of years, 3-4 years time, on the pace of technological development in this period, than you could maybe today. That's something you have to think about. The idea, though, of this alternate history was, why not, when they were building HMS Tiger, when they realized that battle cruisers, one word, were A, so much more expensive than battle cruiser, two words, and B, going to drive up the cost differential between them and things like light cruisers, and the value, etc., and the necessity of having heavier units than light cruisers for your global presence. Why didn't they also go, yeah, let's build some 9.2-inch gun cruisers? Because we have the guns. And that's going to be one of the video discussions we're going to have, is they have the guns. They are putting a lot of money into developing 9.2-inch guns. For a nation which is a navy, and a nation which is supposedly not interested in them, by golly, are there a lot of armaments manufacturers being given the nod and the wink to do some development, because you might get some contracts soon. And that's always an interesting discussion to have with the Royal Navy, because one of the reasons why they sometimes turn down guns, like for initial things of turning down the Vickers 14-inch gun. Not enough armaments manufacturers produced a 14-inch gun. The Royal Navy had no desire to be locked into a monopoly. So they were quite happy with the 13.5-inch. And it made sense from a logistical jump perspective. But that's always quite a interesting thing to discuss with people, and sort of they realize that it's very different than today's thinking. Today's thinking would be, we've got to go for the best weapon available. In the 1900s, 1910s, the Royal Navy was actually thinking, well, we could go for that weapon, but there's only one supplier of that. Or we could go for that weapon, and there's about 3 or 4 we can get guns off, which are all fairly similar and fairly similar properties. So we can get them to manufacture a barrel to a similar standing that we could use it. It's an interesting world. And this is especially more important than even barrels, is ammunition manufacture. And if you've got multiple manufacturers who can produce 13.5-inch ammunition, but only one who can produce 14-inch ammunition, well, that's going to be an ongoing, massive yearly purchase, isn't it? Because there's got to be practice rounds and all those things. So, yeah, it all factors in. And then conversely, theoretically, the Royal Navy's not buying any 9.2-inch gun cruisers, and yet there is lots of development going on. It's a 9.2-inch gun. So let's consider the Tiger timeline. Let's consider the period we're talking about, because this is really the thing you have to start thinking about. We're talking about 1912, 1911. She's ordered 1911, laid down 1912, launched 1913, commissioned 1914, after World War I has begun, decommissioned May 1931. She is arguably one of the most beautiful warships ever built. Her lines, the gracefulness of her construction, everything about her is just elegance and class personified. She really is an absolutely gorgeous looking ship of her period, and deserves a lot more affection than she gets. In many ways, she's already bigger than Renown and Repulse. She isn't as fast as them, but if you'd given her a boiler upgrade, she probably would have been as fast as them. And with 8 13.5-inch guns to their 6 15-inch, possibly more useful in her role. Because the whole point of a battle cruiser is it's supposed to be able to take its enemy out quickly. And volume of fire is a factor in that. Because you see, battle cruiser, 2 words, are what the Invincibles and Indefatigable are. They started this off, and they are lovely ships, but they are basically cruisers with capital ship guns. That's it. That's what they are. They are a cruiser with a capital ship grade gun. That is what they are, all they are, and all they will ever be. They have cruiser level armor. They have cruiser level subdivision. They are cruisers. Okay? And that's one end of the spectrum. And the spectrum moves along, goes to battle cruiser one words, which start off with, realistically, the Lions for the Royal Navy. And then it goes to fast battleships, and then it goes to dreadnought battleships. Now, that sort of, as they're going along, they are exchanging speed for both armor, coverage, and subdivision. Please note what I just said. Armor coverage. I do this description in many videos, and I'm going to keep doing it in this one, because you never know, it might be your first video watching. If it isn't, and you've heard it before, I apologize, but please allow me to explain. Consider a battle cruiser as... basically, if we're going through mounted knights, as someone who's carrying maybe a quick shield, a little bit of a breastplate, helmet, and a lance. That's it. That's all they've got. A battle cruiser, 2 words, has got some leg coverings. Probably carries a sword as well. Well, a sword was quite often a secondary weapon, but also for knights it was more often, especially mounted knights, it was an axe or a mace or something heavy you could pummel down on armor. So, something like, well, carrying a secondary as well. Fast battleships. Definitely carrying the secondary. And they've started got some armor is appearing on the horse. Some protections are appearing on the horse. And then when you've got the battleship, it's full plate armor. There's armor on everything that can be given armor. And they are carrying as many weapons as they can, and they practically need to be craned onto their horses. That's the reality of what we're talking about. Most people tend to look and go, but this ship had 13 inches of armor, which makes it a fast battleship. And you go, what areas was it covering? How was the subdivision beneath it? Was it a honeycomb structure, or was it a bag of lozenges? They start looking a bit funny, and they're going, because the difference is armor thickness. Let's say I've got this thickness of armor, but it's covering this space. Does that make me a battleship? No. But, if I've got this thickness of armor all over me, that's a battleship. That's the point. If it's just covering one spot in full thickness, yeah. And to be honest, as I said, a battle cruiser, 2 words, often the armor coverage isn't even that good. And when you start looking at it, you look at the Renowns, you look at how the Admiral class start out, they start out as battle cruisers, 2 words. They really do. You can be evolved under construction to one level in any of that direction. I would argue that Vanguard starts out as a battle cruiser and moves into the fully armored battle cruiser, not quite a fast battleship because of a subdivision, etc., but jolly close enough that people often don't ignore the difference. So, what is this? Why am I bringing this all back to this? Well, because as you add in more armor, as you add in more subdivision, as you add in more complexity and bigger, more powerful guns, you get more expensive. And the thing is, when the Invincibles first came out, when the ships first came out, they were supposed to take on the full role of the armor cruisers, including the duty of station flagship on foreign stations. They're supposed to be the flagships. They were supposed to be what was representing the Royal Navy as it went round the world. They were supposed to be what was showing that the Royal Navy was present in a region. And remember, this is an important thing, because the Royal Navy is a massive asset for the British in terms of its conflict management and deterrence tools. Having the sloops wander around doing their almost weekly, monthly visits of ports is a great way of showing the flag. Having a light cruiser wander around occasionally as well and show we have bigger assets, even bigger ones can reach you. Being able to deploy something larger than that, the station flagship, when there is a problem. To go, excuse me. Now, you don't want to deal with what comes next, because if you don't take attention to me, then it's the full squadron from the station, and after that, it's a battle squadron coming from the home fleet on a Mediterranean fleet. So listen to me now. It's an important point. It's an important level in the escalation tools. It's an important point of showing your interest. And they've got to have a level of capability. They've got to have a level of skill, a level of firepower to do this. That's what the armoured cruisers do in peacetime. That's what the armoured cruisers are for. And then there's other duties they find themselves doing. Reinforcing and supplementing their lighter cruisers in operations. Reinforcing the battle line. Acting as escorts for key convoys. All these things are missions which you need not just ships for, but I needed a certain level of ship, but also a certain number of ships. And the trouble is, as the battle cruiser outpaces the cost dramatically of what the armoured cruiser had been, as it goes along that scale, it makes it less and less likely you're going to have enough ships. And on top of that, there's also the question of, are they really useful for that role? And this was the question which wasn't asked when it was first being built, because the Invincibles weren't much more expensive than an armoured cruiser. It makes sense. But as they get more powerful, there's suddenly a point of they reach a level of power where they can't go in that port, or you send them and it's too much of a threat. It's too powerful an asset to send. If we use the age of sail definition, very quickly battle cruisers pass the joy of being third-rate equivalents and become second-rates, with the Dreadnought battleships as the first-rates. Now, this is a tolerable scenario while you have enough pre-Dreadnoughts, i.e. Royal Sovereign-style battleships, and enough armoured cruisers in place, they can fill the role of the third-rate. But at a certain point in this period, those ships were going to be starting to be got rid of. They were old. They needed to go. And that starts to limit your capabilities, your options for conflict management, for deterrence, for dealing with problems before they become problems, or in wartime having sufficient mass of available assets to allow your more advanced units to focus on what you want them to do. Because, realistically, do you want an asset like HMS Tiger to be stuck escorting a convoy to deal with surface raiders? Or do you want her free to go and hunt down ships for you? Which do you want? Because you only have one of her. I know there are some books which alleged there was going to be a second one and all sorts of things. There wasn't. There really wasn't. Because, honestly, the Royal Navy starts building them as one-offs and improved iterations, but usually what they are is iterations on that year's battleship design. And the moment the Royal Navy gets the concept of fast battleship, then that's really a problem to start dealing with as a battlecruiser. Because yes, the Queen Elizabeths don't pull it off. They don't. But the Royal Navy has a working concept of what it wants its fast battleships to be. It's going to return to it. It's not just it's going to return to it, Japan's going to return to it. And other nations are returning to it, which makes it even less likely that something like an Invincible is going to be a suitable asset. So if that's the case, what are we talking about? Well, if we consider how armoured cruisers were often ordered and all these other things, this period is close enough to that period and close enough to that flow that probably you're going to be ordering them in 4s. You're probably looking at ordering 4s. And again, if you're ordering them alongside, there's enough yards like, well, to give an example, the Thames Iron Works. A great yard, a yard which had launched the Sans Peril, which had launched battleships even more recently than that. It was one of the key yards that had helped build the Royal Navy. HMS Warrior was launched there. HMS Thunderer had been launched there in 1911, an Orion-class super dreadnought. And there are other yards as well, and there are slips, and there is the space to build these ships. To order them and build these ships. So that's not the problem. We're talking about between 6 and 8 9.2 inch guns. I prefer 8 myself, but I did do a 6 gun scenario because I used Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. It has some limitations. It doesn't have a cruiser size which goes up big enough for what I think these are. I think they'd be 15 to 18,000 tons. It doesn't have a battlecruiser design which goes down small enough. I actually, played around with them, worked them out. They've got 4-inch secondaries. There's 12 to 15,000 ton range. There's a 15 to 18,000 ton range. That's you're sort of looking somewhere in that region. If you're considering by this point we are talking about Tiger being 28,000 tons, we are talking about other ships coming, the light cruisers coming in at about 6,000 tons. There needs to be something in the middle. Okay, there's a wide bracket of where you could build it. Steam turbines and small tube boilers. And again, if we consider in this period, there's a lot of discussion going on in the Royal Navy about small tube boilers, whether they're suitable for battleships, whether they're suitable for other things. Building them into this sort of class of cruiser, if they're a station cruiser, if it works out badly, you can deal with it. They can just sit on a foreign station pootling around. They don't need their high speed. If it works out well, you've got a great new design going forward. And the thing is, if you're ordering them in 1912, if they're laid down in 1912, well, if we think about it, that would be about the same time, if not a little earlier, but about the same time as the Queen Elizabeth class, which of course we're looking into it, but they didn't get the small tube boilers. They decided not to, so fitting them to them makes sense, and also opens up the interesting possibility that the R class gets small tube boilers, because they're laid down in December 1913, November 1913, sort of the first ones of them. If they decide small tube boilers are working fine in their testings when they're sort of a year ahead on these, they might put them into the R class, which could have all sorts of impacts on history, but we'll leave that to one side. They're a good mix ships, and they are ships designed to be a station flagship, and actually mentally I kept calling them a sort of station cruiser, because that's one of the phrases which goes around the time. There's also other descriptions and ideas which go around for what they could be called, and this is a debate which has been raging in the Royal Navy since about 1910, by about this point. And for those who know, that's about the same time HMS Queen Mary, the preceding battle cruiser to Tiger, was ordered, and was ordered as part of the 1910-11 naval program. And while Lion and Princess Royal were actually under construction. So the thing is, this debate has been going for a while. This debate is what Fisher will take advantage of to get his Courageous, Glorious and Furious built, his large light cruisers. Which is also another phraseology put around time, but it's amazing how many admirals, especially people like Jellicoe, hated that phrase because they didn't consider it contradictory. You can't have a large light cruiser. You have a light cruiser. Your large cruiser is your battle cruiser. A large light cruiser is just you playing with words to get things through. It doesn't tell you anything. So I think station cruiser. I don't think armoured cruiser. There was a tempting one which was a Dreadnought Cruiser. A proper Dreadnought Cruiser was a phrase put forward. And there is a partner which attempted to go, they'd have battle cruisers, Dreadnought Cruisers and light cruisers as a set of phraseology. But again, that's a bit confusing. That's again causing trouble with the battle cruisers, and these ships would be made to. They are not part of the capital ship race. They're not part of the escalations. They're not part of that end of the argument at all. They are entirely focused on we need a cruiser at this level, something which is bigger, more powerful than light cruisers, but is not as expensive, so we can provide the mass, the quantity to the quality that is the battle cruisers. It can provide the ships for convoy escorts in most of the world's theatres. It can provide the ships that are going to be stationed flagships. It can provide the ships that are going to be waiting in places to deal with threats. And it's got to be powerful enough that it can deter a battle cruiser. Now the surface raider's going to go, I will win this fight, but I will probably suffer enough damage I won't win the next fight. So it's better for me not to join it. It's a tough balancing act to go for. It is. Then we have the 9.2-inch gun debate, because there's actually a gun debate. I have selected the 9.2-inch gun. The 9.2-inch gun is the obvious gun. There's a reason it's the secondary on the Lord Nelson class. There's the reason it's on all the armoured cruisers, pretty much. It's the gun which the Royal Navy looks to as the big cruiser punch weapon. And actually explains the choice and selection of armament for Blucher and all the other things, this weapon system. Because, yeah, this is what the Royal Navy chooses as a heavy cruiser weapon. But there are options. There are quite a few options. There is, in Royal Navy service, definitely available in this period, there's the Mark 10, which is on the Warrior class, which I think this one, and the Mark 11, which is on the Minotaur class. Now, the Mark 11 is a 50 cal, so that must be better than the 46.7, 47 cal one on a 9 Mark 10, right? Well, it isn't. It wears out a lot quicker, a lot more quickly, and whilst it does have some impressive firing ranges and does have some impressive results, and is better on the cruisers than it is on Lord Nelson class, certainly in terms of the mount they fit, it's not really a successful weapon at all. And in fact, if those are your only options, you probably would be sensible to go with a Mark 10. That's the sensible option to do. That would be the absolute sensible option to do, to go with a Mark 10. It's got a good rate of fire, it's got everything. And we could stop there, but I've already told you, I've already mentioned the fact that there's a lot of guns under development in terms of 9.2 inches. And that leads us to, well, all of these. And this lovely, lovely discussion point. And yes, there is, as you can see, a Glatton class monitor there to display off their Mark 12 9.2 inch gun. Now, here's the fun thing. The Mark 12 is officially dated to roughly 1913. Now, when I say roughly 1913, I mean roughly 1913 because, well, it actually seems to be a bit earlier. It really does. There is certainly a discussion about its availability and development going around in our period, and we only need it to be dated from 1912, and if it's question mark 1913 and it's probably earlier, 1912 is not a bad fit for it to be suitable. It has restored the barrel life of the earlier guns. It's technically a 51 cal, and whilst we only have the ranges, maximum ranges achieved firing in a monitor turret, so where it could get up to 40 degrees, with that range hitting 30,000 and 39,000 yards, depending on whether they had superchargers or not, the odds are it's going to be fairly decent at 15 degrees and 30 degrees. It's going to be on a par or probably slightly better than the Mark 11, and definitely better than the Mark 10 and Mark 9. Now, interesting enough, they all have rather a similar battle rate of fire. Again, 2 shots per minute is what they average under battle conditions. The 12-inch guns in this period averaged under battle conditions 1.5 rounds for this time, and that's the original 12-inch guns with the original fittings and settings in their turrets. As things improved, and by the time you get up to World War II, it's the number of guns, etc. Most of these guns, we're talking in terms of capital ship grades, are 2 rounds a minute. Okay, technology's improved. The equivalent 9.2-inch gun, therefore, by World War II, could be getting a lot higher, but we'll leave that to one side. The fact is, the Mark 12, which is produced in very few numbers, would seem to be the best choice if it's available. It would seem to be a far better choice than the Mark 10, the Mark 10 due to its range, and the Mark 11 due to its barrel life. And the reason I've put a question mark by the 450 there is because there are some reports that it survived more rounds than being fired than that. But that's, of course, by under monitor firing conditions, which means it's often more carefully measured firing. And again, the 2 rounds per minute are achieved in a monitor turret. So we have a set of options. And the 12-inch guns, yeah, they can do 21,200 yards. But most cruiser engagements are reckoned to take place at less than 13,000 yards. Most cruiser engagements, I believe, too. And this is a pre-radar era. A pre-radar era. So, if you've got something which can give you good gunnery control and gunnery firing out to 18,000 yards, and I see no reason at all why the Mark 12 couldn't do that, considering its range at 40 degrees. And working out the level of force and power going through it. Then you've got a very viable asset. A very viable asset. And yes, it's not the same as the capital ship guns, but that's the point. They're not capital ships. And they're not really supposed to be soloing in a gunnery duel versus a capital ship. If they are soloing in a gunnery duel versus a battle cruiser, that's in convoy protection, and their point is to score enough damage that the next ship which comes along catches that battle cruiser and smacks her. That's the point, realistically. And again, we go back to the speed. I stuck 28 knots there. I stuck 28 knots there as that was the speed required for the cruiser line at this point, the cruiser line of the fleet, and that was the speed required of HMS Tiger. And 28 knots does matter. 28 knots has an impact and a bearing, especially if you're building something which, like the Minotaur on this design, looks rather like a HMS Tiger. Now, again, hasn't got quite the same amount of funnels. That's one big funnel rather than lots of little funnels. But honestly, if you're engaging at ranges, that might not be noticed so much as the gun layout and where the ship is lighting up and its overall shaping. And so that's why I went with the overall shaping I did in these designs. So, I would say I'm happy with a 9.2-inch gun as a choice. Comparing it compared to the available British 12-inch gun at the time, which is so much heavier as a gun, which the rounds and ammunition are so much heavier. The amount of space it's going to require, the turret facility it's going to require, all these things are going to push for a far more expensive ship. And we're in the process of producing something for mass. If battle cruisers had stuck with the level of Invincibles and just been churned out as Invincibles, we would not be having this conversation. It would not make sense under any circumstances, because they would exist and they'd be cost efficient enough to produce in enough numbers they could pretty much do the job. But that wasn't the way the world went. Just as with the Juno-Cole, the quick-firing guns came along. In the case of the battle cruisers, it looked like a battleship, it had the guns of a battleship, therefore people started expecting it to fight other battle cruisers, at which point you are inevitably into the same race that you are in with battleships. Who has the biggest, meanest, most powerful one of them? And that means they're getting expensive. And the point about cruisers in this period is they are the quantity. They're a little bit of the quality, but they are the quantity. They are the third rates, the fourth rates, and the fifth rates, equivalents of the age of sail. That's what they are in this period. So what could it have led to? And what could have led to this? As we know, as I've already mentioned and already discussed, there is rather a key point going on here. There is the rising cost of the ships. And that is something which cannot be overlooked, because again, even though the Royal Navy has as much money as it does have, it doesn't have an infinite budget. It doesn't have infinite resources. And it has to make a political calculation. It has to make an economic calculation. I.e., we can get this money out of the government this year. In this period, you have to remember, there's the We Want 8 campaign comes along. The Royal Navy is getting a lot of money from the government for destroyers. They're building a large number of light cruisers. They are producing the most balanced fleet by far of any of the major powers involved in the naval races going on in the world. By long distance, they are producing the most balanced fleet. Adding on this money, they have to justify it. Now, they could justify it, but it's going to be costly. Now, I've already mentioned the fact that these ships I've put together based on the interests of the people involved, on the affections of the people involved, what they wanted out of these ships, and what was the existing debate going on, and existing discussions, and letters. The letters. And part of it is also a factor of the concentration caused by naval races in Europe. So Britain could not have the battle cruisers out around the world. They couldn't even have them out regularly sailing around the world as they wanted them to be doing, to cover the stations that way. No, they needed them concentrated. They could maybe free one or two every now and again. Maybe a couple sitting in the Mediterranean. You need these ships. You need these ships. And there is an advantage to putting the small tube boilers and other things into them. One of the things the Royal Navy itself had noted, it had used the armoured cruisers and the sheer mass they were producing often to de-risk technology for the battleships. You can do that. You can test out concepts in an armoured cruiser. When you go size of the fleet the Royal Navy is, when you're ordering the number of ships they are, you can test out concepts for your battleship, because they'll still work for your armoured cruiser in an armoured cruiser for like a tenth of the price. And if it goes wrong, stick it on the South America station. Stick it in the Caribbean. Use it for a few years, then stick it into reserve. No one will ask any questions. It wasn't as successful as you hoped it was, but you managed to get some use out of it. It's a hull. It has big guns and looks shiny. Biggest benefit from the Royal Navy perspective selling internally is they have a lot of problem at this point having enough captain's positions for training up captains to go into battle cruisers, to go into faster, large ships, and how to handle them. I would argue, again, this is something which the Royal Navy had, let's say, started dealing with during the Lion class. When the Lion class had been launched and they'd gone down this route, the Royal Navy might have found itself with captains who, captains and lots more senior officers and gunnery officers who had much more experience in terms of handling a fast, large ship, maneuvering at speed, engaging targets at speed, by the time World War I came around. And that might have changed the approach and the training of the battlecruiser force. Might have changed some of their decisions about what gunnery practices to adopt, because they've had the experience. It might not have. There is always a chance. It's like, sometimes I look at some things which are written below the alternate histories when we're looking at them, and people are certain it's going to cause this, and I cannot be 100% certain. I have the logic, and I'm giving you what I think are the most likely scenarios that come from it. But no one's 100% certain. This is a postulation, it's a discussion, and brings to light a lot of interesting information. But yes, I do see such a group of ships to be the test beds. They will be what is being pushed forward and what is being used to test out. Does this work as an idea? It does. Great. Now, please note, there is a small apology for this one and this one. When you're trying to put treble 4-inch mounts in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, it decides that has to be a turret, not a mount. So they'll come out looking like turrets. But of course, the Royal Navy at this point had the treble 4-inch guns, and they were all turrets. They were all mounts, not turrets. I mean, they were all unshielded at the back. They were terrible, but I put them in because that's the historically accurate what they'll be putting in them. Makes sense for a battlecruiser, though, to have a very much a quick-firing secondary, because if any ship is going to find itself lumbering into things like coastal torpedo boats, etc., it's probably going to be a battlecruiser at high speed doing a reconnaissance run. With that, we get to the shameless book plug. So, this is the part of the video where I thank you for your support for making this possible. Making it possible for me to do all this research and all this publication on YouTube, because I love it. I love the interactions, I love being able to go off and do the research and do the kind of naval history which I like, which is the general naval history. I was having this conversation with someone the other day who was going, you're very much a generalist, aren't you? Yes. I do a lot of engineering naval history. I have some areas I really do like to focus on, deterrence and ship construction and the theory and doctrines behind why we construct the ships we do and all those things, and development of naval aviation, and quite a lot on submarines as well these days, it seems. But yeah, I'm a generalist. I will literally teach any part of naval history, engineering history quite happily. I will go off and study it. I love it. I geek out all it. I have a very bad habit when it comes to bookstores. I tend to buy whatever I see in there that I like, and me and Amazon have a long-standing relationship, as do me and many other online bookstores. They haven't yet introduced someone who customizedly pops up as a 3D avatar to go, "Welcome, Dr. Clarke, you're back again. Is your credit card ready to cry?" But I'm expecting it. I'm expecting it. And all that's possible thanks to you. The research trips are possible thanks to you. The calyxes which now surround my office and have allowed me to put up bookshelves, even though I am still getting over pneumonia and so couldn't build the bookshelves I wanted to build on the walls, etc. It's all thanks to you. All this stuff is thanks to you. So thank you. You make the channel possible. Your likes, your shares, your watching the videos, your commenting, your super chats and super thanks, your memberships, your Patreon memberships, all these things make it possible. Speaking of which, Patreon, when this video goes live, it'll be the last day you can upload suggestions for December and January, because the vote will go live on Sunday. And I've delayed it a bit, but I should be able to make it work. Hopefully I'll be able to make it work. And the thing is going to be the top 4 from the top 4 will get made into videos. lives and recorded videos. The videos that come 5 to 8 in the vote will be made into premieres. So the top 8 videos will all be made. 4 will be made into lives as well as recorded videos, and 4 will be made into just recorded videos across the 2-month period. And I'm literally doing that because I'm recognizing the limitations of my body at the moment and my stamina, and the fact I need to try and get as much work done as I can during the daytime, so I can, even though I still don't sleep. This is a really weird thing. I've had my lovely functioning insomnia still doesn't mean I get sleep, but I try and rest overnight. I try and, relax as much as I can, get as much sleep as I do feel like getting, as my body will let me, but it gives me more energy during the day, and thank you for that. And thank you for your support, which has made everything else possible. So, I don't like to keep these two things too long, but I do like to say thank you. I like to say thank you everyone who's supposed to be buying and purchasing the book and been recommending it, etc. It's really nice for you, because yeah, that's how academics get promoted, how they get hired, how they get permanent contracts, etc. in the UK, is how well their books do. For that, let's look at the impact of these ships pre-war. So with that all covered, let's get into this again. So let's say they have got these 4, because the only thing that's stopping them is not wanting to use up political capital. They've got the infrastructure, they can get the money, they've got the personnel. Crewing these ships is not going to cause a massive trouble. In fact, one of the things it might enable them to do is get rid of some of the older ships more quick. They would probably be planning on getting rid of those older ships when they came into service. So they're probably actually not going to get rid of any of the older ships, because, again, they're not going to enter service till war starts. And amazingly, during 1914, the British government the Royal Navy really doesn't get rid of any ships. It really doesn't get rid, unless the ship is absolutely no value at all, even in tertiary line duties, not even secondary line duties or it's not able for first line duties, fine. Second line duties, then we're definitely keeping it. Tertiary line duties. What's tertiary, by the way, if you've never heard the phrase? Tertiary line duties are usually things like combat support for amphibious operations, providing troop transport, providing operational presence in regions which have no threat of conflict at all, but that's only as long as you have a presence there. It's a case of, okay, so we need a vessel in this region for counter-piracy operations, because if we're not there, it's going to be a frigating nightmare, and it's going to be requiring us to actually send a lot of resources we don't want to send there. So what's a old vessel we've got that still floats, is mildly viable in combat against something which is armed with basically a teaspoon and a paper towel, and will do the job. Oh, that one will do. That's tertiary line duties. Second line duties includes convoy escort and a few other some patrol areas, some areas where there might well be surface raiders present, but you're supposed to be able to deal with the surface raiders, etc., especially if you're a large enough vessel. And first line, of course, is all those primary duties, those combat duties we hear about, the stuff, where there's the big battles and those things. That's what you're looking at as your assets for that. Now, the really interesting thing is the good old Blucher, with her 8.3-inch guns, suddenly has a lease of life in this scenario. She suddenly looks viable. She looks terrible, but she suddenly looks viable, because she's got a speed of 25.4 knots and 12 8.3-inch guns. And now the Royal Navy's bringing something into service which has 8 9.2-inch guns, which can outrange her, and have a speed of 28 knots, so can outperform her and dictate the range of combat, because you need a 3-knot advantage for that. 2.6 knots will do. And that's on a good day, remember. They're going to have turbines and small tube boilers. She's going to have triple expansion engines. the difference is not going to be good for her. The difference is really not going to be good for her. In fact, it could be even worse, because small tube boilers, let's say they fit them conservatively, not believing they've got the level of efficiency upgrades that they do bring, and you could find you're dealing with ships which actually have a speed of 30 knots? Sorry, I have hat hair suddenly come on today. Not sure why, but it's causing me to fidget with it. You could, because how the maths works with that scenario is, let's say I presume the boilers work in, I've got these figures for their efficiency and their percentage. And let's say I go, well, I think they're going to be actually about 90% of that efficiency, because, frankly, it's unlikely. And I already factor in cut downs, because I don't want to be running them on full power, because I need them to last a certain number of years, and I want all these things. So my peacetime levels, I'm designing for a peacetime speed of 28 knots. The speed advantage that the British ships can end up having over the Blue could be quite considerable. There could be all sorts of things which could factor into it. But saying that, the ships themselves are not going to have much of an impact in terms of in the pre-war years. If we consider the French, they're maxing out all their construction with building dreadnoughts. They've maxed out all their facilities. So they're not really going to be able to build anything else. The Italians don't have the infrastructure to build anything more. The Germans are already building a lopsided navy as it is. Again, if I've said this before, but please go look at the Battle of Jutland, the building the fleets for Jutland video I've done on this channel. There is actually a couple of people have actually argued that I've underestimated the number of yards which the Royal Navy could have gone to. My rule is I've gone with yards which actually had contracts awarded to them. There are a couple of yards which could, in theory, have assisted in the operations, but which never got contracts awarded to them, including one which went bankrupt during this period. So yeah, that there are things. The British have quite a large infrastructure, mainly thanks to consistent investment for the previous century and a half. That's the secret to having infrastructure. Consistent investment for 150 years. You suddenly find yourself with oodles of infrastructure. And depth to that infrastructure. It's amazing. But the Germans don't really have the facilities. Interestingly enough, the Americans, again, are building a lopsided fleet, but the interesting thing that comes with this, the Lexington class are laid down in 1920, 1921, and they're, of course, laid down as battle cruisers. There is a part of me which wonders in this scenario whether, especially with Senator Tillman still alive for the time he is, and his obsession with, well, the reason he's pushing for the big battleships is he wants to restart cruiser construction in America, because Charleston Naval Yard, which is his naval yard, the one in his constituency, can't build battleships, can build cruisers. They can't fit any of those battle cruisers onto the Charleston Yard. They could, in theory, with some investment in the yard from the federal government, which honestly Tillman would probably get, could in theory have been getting these. The vessels of this size, which might mean that the Lexington class are not battle cruisers, but are actually station cruisers, with some kind of variation of a 9.2 inch or of a gun on that sort of scale and size. Which would be a really interesting variation of history, but I don't see anything happening in the pre-war period. There isn't enough money, there isn't enough funding, enough political support, there isn't enough infrastructure going around for pretty much anyone in the world to copy them. There is the possibility, and I would factor this in as heavily, is that the British might order 4, but they also might get the Dominions to order them as well, and they are a perfect size vessel for the Dominions. Look at how quickly the Australians especially snap up the county class post World War One. Having HMS Australia plus a couple of these wandering around, that's a good size squadron to have as their core of their force in Australia to help defend them and to help provide their protection. It could even be tempting to the Canadians, etc., because the Canadians don't really want to invest in battleships. Again, I could see them far more likely going, well, we know we said we'd be interested in some Queen Elizabeths, but we'd prefer to build some of these, because we can support and sustain these. And actually that happening. I could see that happening. But it's a strong possibility. It's not a certainty, but it is a very strong possibility that Australia, Canada, I doubt South Africa or India. New Zealand's always an option. Maybe Malaya even. Malaya might, because Malaya funds a battleship historically. They, like New Zealand funds a battle cruiser. They might decide to actually take one on and have one as part of their force. If the British do order 4 a year, every year between 1912, 1913 and 1914, there's 12 in construction. If they get 2 more ordered each year by the Dominions, who knows how many. That could be a Canadian one is ordered each year. Australian ones are ordered first and second year, and 1914 it's a Malayan one or New Zealand one. You would have 18 in various stages of production, and you could do it. Does that preclude that doesn't really affect any of the merchant ship construction. That does mean yards like Thames Ironworks stay open. Thames Ironworks, if it stays open, could probably be handling about 3 of those in various stages at a time. Such ships. There are other yards which have space, and what you've also got to think about is if you've got this production and people know this construction's coming, facilities will be made available for it. I mean, if you want to see how quickly the British, when they want to, because of the various ways the UK Constitution works, can make space for things when they want to, just look at the story of HMS Hood. Look at the story of half the ships that were being constructed in this period, when the yards suddenly went, you know what, we want to build this, but it turns out the slipway we want to build on is not big enough. We're going to need to knock down some houses on the street. Oh, really? Yeah, planning reckons it's going to delay us by about 12 months. 2 days later. The street's going to be knocked down tomorrow. Okay. Central government can work occasionally to its own advantage when it needs to. It has the powers and it has the levers. It has them. Doesn't always use them. So, what else happens? But realistically, without much physical presence and people not building to counter them, they're not going to have, because of no physical presence because they're not in service, they're not going to have that much of an effect on things. But then we get into the other option here. What are they going to have in terms of psychological impact? They're going to cause a further issue for the Germans in terms of the end of the Anglo-German naval race, because there is the sensible argument that the Queen Elizabeth class raised the cost of capital ship construction, of battleship construction, to the point in which the Heer and the Kaiserliche Marine become at loggerheads over funding, and the Kaiserliche Marine is never going to win that argument. Then the R-class really kick the boot in when they're ordering that many. And that pretty much means that the Germans from that point on are no longer in a quantitative race. They actually try and change to a qualitative race to join in the qualitative race which the Americans and the Austro-Hungarians to an extent, but the Americans, the Japanese, the Italians and the Brits have been waging quite happily. The French are also by this point aiming to join that, but again, the trouble with being a late joiner into the qualitative race, like the Germans are, is you have a lot of ground you have to catch up quickly. A lot of ground. To be able to leap ahead and start setting the pace and doing the necessary work within the qualitative background, you need to be a qualitative race, you need to be doing that research. And to be fair, the really funny thing about the qualitative race, which the Germans really didn't seem to ever twig, which is always fun to me, is that the British, the Americans, the Italians and the Japanese are all to an extent sharing technology while doing it. They're racing each other and sharing technology. There are British turbines are powering pretty much all of them, and the Germans. and some of the French. The British turbines are basically the cornerstone of it all. But there's also other British components popping in. Of course, the Japanese order some of their ships from Britain. But so do the Italians order some big components. And the British order some components from Italy and some components from America. And America orders some components from Britain. And they're actually all... They're in a qualitative race, but it's the kind of qualitative race, as I've always said, when people bring up that naval race. A naval race which has heat in it. Which is more than just going... Look at my car. It's got a bigger bonnet than yours. Sort of thing. Which is the equivalent of what this race was between countries. There was heat, perhaps between the Japanese and the Americans to extent at this point, but not as much as there would later on be. But this race is all more about ego and feeling secure because we have the biggest, baddest system around. And as such, they're actually almost supporting each other doing it. So that's not really going to affect them, but for the Germans, the fact that these ships are being built and they are going to outclass and outpace outclass the Blucher and outpace quite a lot of their battle cruisers is probably going to worry them, because these 4 ships are going to be a supplement to the British battle cruisers. No, they can't go toe-to-toe with the German battle cruisers. Well, they can go toe-to-toe with them, but they don't want to go toe-to-toe with them solo. But enough of them in a battle line along with the battle cruisers, that could cause trouble, especially when you consider they're 28 knots. So the thing is, they can back up the 28 knot ships, or the 27.5 knot ships that are some of the Lions, etc., and form a far stronger group, so they cannot be tied down to the speed of the Invincibles and Indefatigables, which are slower. Service entry then. Well, I could see them being pushed through quite quickly. And I could certainly see a couple ending down in the Falklands. Because if you're working them up, it's a good place to send them. And joining Craddock's squadron. The thing is, though, 2 of them there is going to completely alter that battle. The Battle of Coronel takes place. It's going to be a completely different battle. You suddenly got ships turning up which have each of them 8 9.2 inch guns. That's 16 9.2 inch guns. That changes that battle. Historically, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau dominate this battle because they are 2 of the most modern warships available, and especially this battle. They have a top speed of 22.5 knots. They have 8 8.3 inch guns each, and they are a battle line for the cruiser fighting. They'd be completely outclassed, though, by the Tiger Cubs. By these vessels. And the nickname for them is the Tiger Cubs because they're based on Tiger, but shrunken down to 9.2 inch guns. These cruisers would dominate them. And specifically with their speed advantage, you'd have a very real scenario that Craddock would probably change flagship. He would probably change from Good Hope to one of these ships, and he'd probably end up with a fast division and a slow division. And the fast division would be HMS Glasgow and the 2 Tiger Cubs. The slow division would be Good Hope, would be Monmouth, would be Otranto. And they'd be a fairly good force together. And I could see the Germans thinking they were going to go and go, oh, we spotted Monmouth, we spotted Good Hope. They've only got a couple of 9.2 inch guns, or, I think, yeah. They basically have a couple of 9.2 inch guns on Good Hope. Monmouth has nothing. And then, whoosh. High speed, boom, 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 the horizon goes aflame, and oh, frigate! They're there. And frigate, of course, is another name they could have been used for them. There was a consideration, like there was a consideration for battle cruisers being called frigates. Fisher did honestly consider that, and that he did put the name back in circulation. So there is a chance that these vessels would have come into service as frigates. That changes history amazingly. We have battle cruisers, we have frigates, and we have light cruisers. What are the frigates? They are the 9.2-inch gunned heavy middle of the road cruisers, but we don't like the phrase medium cruiser because that has a weird connotations in this time period. Station cruiser sounds boring and not cruisery, so we wanted something else, so we've gone with frigate. And the thing is, there's a scenario where they decide to link everything into the cruiser designation, and they have what they call the heavy frigates and the light frigates. The light cruisers becoming light frigates, the 9.2-inch gunships becoming the heavy frigates, and then you have the battle cruisers up above, and that makes everything nice and easy. And then we have a whole different world where, who knows, maybe the brig's brought back as the ASW escort? Because it goes sloop, corvette. The sloop was the full naval build. The corvette was the maritime, was the merchant, was as close to merchant build as possible to make it to get it through. And then the frigate was a twin screwed, sort of in between naval civilian build vessel. That came in later in World War II, and that became the ASW, and then everything got subsumed into frigates for ASW warfare. If frigates had gone earlier, who knows? But anyway, the Tiger Cubs are going to dominate this battle. They are going to have the latest in targeting technology to fire control. They're going to have 9.2-inch guns, which will have the range on these be able to outrange the 8.3s, and they're going to be able to outpace them by a significant margin, at least 5.5 knots. And remember, that's 5.5 knots if Scharnhorst and Eisenhower's hulls are fresh, their boilers are all working fine, everything's perfect. Basically, what they managed to do to the 23-knot speed of Monmouth and Good Hope, the Tiger Cubs can do to them. That's going to change this battle. And why would I say 2 would be deployed down there? Because it's the obvious place to send a couple. If you have a couple available, and if you got 6 ordered in 1912, they are going to come into service, as said, by October. Possibly September, maybe November. But they're probably going to be spread through that sort of period. Cruisers can be slightly quicker build in this period. They can be rushed through a bit, so they could even be August, but it's probably going to be about that point. They'll be commissioned, all tested. They are ships you can send rapidly south to reinforce Craddock's force. You don't have any commitments elsewhere, and it's the easiest way to bump up the force structure. Even one of them turning up would be a nightmare for Scharnhorst and Eisenhower. And they're the 2 ships which matters in making a nightmare for. 2 turning up means they are more than matched. And they can't run away. Again, I refer you to the 28-knot speed. They're not getting away. Everything else works out as before. This turns into a battle where the British win. It might not be a lossless win if they do manage to catch the slow group under fire early enough, and they're not able to. The fast group don't get in there in time quickly enough. They might still lose ships, but I doubt they're going to be that far apart because their speed of distance is going to be dictated by the radio capabilities of the era, which means they're not going to be a long way away. Probably means Craddock survives this battle, which is an interesting thing for later on, and we will discuss that. But if this is a quick battle, there's no victory at Coronel, it's just a quick British battle, a quick British win, that changes history. You don't see the Invincibles get deployed south and going for their battle. So the battle cruisers are now have lost to Goeben because they're not going to be early enough to help out the Goeben incident, and they haven't had the redeeming battle which comes after. They haven't had the Battle of Falklands. But what has had the Battle of the Falklands are these Tiger Cubs. They've had the Battle of Coronel though, and they've won that. Their Battle of the Falklands moment. They have now will now have the impression the battle cruisers let the Goeben get away. It wasn't they were out of position and none of the cruisers were in the right place, etc. Doesn't matter. The battle cruisers let that. The frigates, the Tiger Cubs, they didn't let their prey get away. They took it out. Suddenly they're going to start to be attractive and they're going to start to be part of the war effort. You're going to start seeing their images. Craddock is also going to start getting attention as a survivor as well. And I could very well see a result of this scenario, a squadron being attached to the battlecruiser forces back in the Grand Fleet, and Craddock being recalled to command it. As a sort of deputy commander of the force under Beatty. Which is a really interesting scenario, because the one thing Craddock does quite well down south in the Falklands and in the South Atlantic, etc., is communicate with senior officers and tell them what he's doing. They aren't always paying attention, but that's the one thing Craddock, or rather Craddock's staff, does do well, is they tell people what they're doing. They tell people what's going on. They provide regular and relevant updates. Which is interesting. What's the impact on the political construction news? Well, I'm sorry Battenberg is still going. There is no way even a victory in Coronel saves Battenberg. There's too much of a political campaign going on to him. But don't worry, Fisher is not going to have the glory he necessarily would like to get. For starters, with the Tiger Cubs being built, there's going to be no justification for him getting courageous, glorious, and furious, because why do you need them? You've got these. You've got dozens of you've got 18 of these under construction. Why do you need to build 3 such ships? I want flagships for those groups. No, they don't. They're not needed. They're not necessary. There's also going to be an interesting question, and this might affect Renown or Repulse, is that how do you justify extra battle cruisers in a scenario where you've got battle cruisers and a superiority of battle cruisers, and you've got these coming in as well? Now, I think he still might be able to swing it. He might be able to say we need some 15-inch gun battle cruisers to deal with their next generation of ships coming through, and he might be able to get Renown Repulse through. But the interesting thing is, if the R-Class have gone small tube boiler, then there is the possibility that they're already faster than they were historically, maybe the same speed as the Queen Elizabeths. And there is also the possibility that therefore when you're building it, you could get 3 battle cruisers out of it. Because if you're going to be pausing the designs to change them, you might go, well, the remaining 3 Rs, so we'll get resistance as well as an R-Class battlecruiser. He does order some small tube boilers historically at this point. They're the ones for Furious. The ones for Courageous and Glorious come from somewhere. It's amazing. There's another project which is cancelled. We won't get into the whole topic of HMS Agincourt. I've done a video on that. Probably that still gets cancelled. But I really do think Courageous class just don't exist. Battenberg falls, but the Courageous class do not come about. And the Tiger Cubs, they're in service. Now, the other thing is, though, that means that the ships which he considers absolutely essential for his Baltic plan are to an extent already there. These 9.2-inch gun cruisers, these frigates, these station cruisers, these whatever you want to call them, the Tiger Cubs, they're it. And if they've started racking up victories, that's going to be helpful for the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy's big problem with World War I is giving itself a narrative for what it did during the war. It does a lot during the war, but it doesn't have the same narrative as the Western Front, because that's a visible, ongoing, mass involvement. You need a narrative of victories which allow Britain to control the sea for the Royal Navy to talk about, to put forward their case for their funding, for their survival, for their investment. Winning Coronel, that starts that off. It really does. But that leads us to the Battle of Dogger Bank then. Now, Dogger Bank takes place in January 1915. January 1915. So there could be between 4 and 6 station cruisers, these cruisers available. 4 to 6 of them. Why do I say that? Well, A, it's where the 2 from Coronel got to. They've probably returned to the UK with Craddock as their squadron commander. That would be a very sensible thing for them to do, and very likely thing, especially with Fisher in power. Fisher will want to bring the hero back, and it's also a good insurance for him to keep Beatty in line, to find a hero to be his second in command. And, yeah. Add between 4 and 6. It depends if and I think they would have done. I think you've probably got at least a Canadian one and an Australian one at this point added on to it. Now, if you've got all 6 of them in service by this point, and all 6 probably are recently commissioned and available, unless one had a lot of damage done in the Battle of Coronel, but so that's why I've done the 4 with 6 in brackets. So I think there'll be at least 4 there, but there could be 6. You then have a very different force turn up. You have a very different force. 5 cruisers slash battle cruisers slash battle cruisers. 7 light cruisers. 35 destroyers. And these 4 to 6 ships. And the interesting thing, as I pointed out earlier, is you've got Lion, Princess Royal, 27 half-knot ships. Tiger's a 28-knot ship. You suddenly have those 3, which are your battle cruisers, your one-word battle cruisers, remember the comment. They're able to race ahead with the support of these ships, these big cruisers, to back them up to hunt the Germans. And so that means that the German pace, which is roughly 25 knots, dictated by their ships and the viability of the vessels they have with them in terms of the speed they can do. Remember, Blucher's top speed is 25.4 knots. Well, suddenly, A, the contact can take place quicker. B, if you're focusing in fire from a distance, it could well look like there's half a dozen Tigers chasing you. Either a long way away, or not as long a way away. You don't know which one you focus in on with your firing. And the thing is, 9.2-inch guns are going to do a lot of damage to German armour. And if you've got a second squadron there, and you've got good old Craddock doing his commander role, then one of the things, whilst I don't expect him to massively challenge Beatty, I do expect that the scenario whereby all the battle cruisers end up smashing into one ship and leaving the others going doesn't happen, because Craddock is also the kind of guy who charges at the enemy and wants to get as close to them as possible. And if the battle cruisers start to pause, they're going to notice these cruisers are sailing right past them, charging towards the German battle cruiser they're trying to retreat. And that becomes a very big problem. That becomes a truly big problem for the Germans, because what's at the Battle of Dogger Bank? It's Seydlitz, top speed 26.5 knots. It's Moltke, top speed 25.5 knots. It's the Flinger, top speed 26.5 knots. And Blucher, of course, 25.4 knots. You add in the first battle cruiser squadron, because that's what Lion, Tiger, and Princess Royal are. Add in the first... I'm just going to call them the frigate squadron. First frigate squadron. Maybe the first and second frigate squadron, depending on how many ships are in there, but let's call it the first, with all the ships grouped underneath there. That force can run into the first and second scouting groups, even with their 18 torpedo boats with them, and wreck them. Especially when you consider that force will most likely be being kept up with by Southampton, Birmingham, Lowestoft, Nottingham, Aurora, Arethusa, Undaunted, i.e. the 5 light cruisers, the 7 light cruisers wandering with them, spread across the 1st Light Cruiser Squadron and the Harwich Force, and 35 destroyers. A lot of those ships can keep up with those vessels pushing on, motoring at 28 knots. A lot of them can. Some of them can't. Southampton can't. She's 25.5 knots, and most of them. Well, officially she can't. Please note, we're going to go with officially she can't. You have to wreck things for them to do so. But you have enough of the light cruisers. I think the Harwich Force can keep up with them pretty much. So probably what you get is the 1st Light Cruiser Squadron, maybe just escorts the 2nd Battle Cruiser Squadron, and the Harwich Force, the 1st Battle Cruiser Squadron, and these cruisers, these frigates, go forward and fight the Germans. They've got enough of a speed advantage. They're going to do enough damage as they did historically. The Germans will probably lose more ships than just Blucher. There is the very real scenario in this battle that they lose all of them. And don't get me wrong, if they lose all of them, the British will lose ships as well. But there is a very real scenario that the German scouting group gets taken out completely. If we consider the fact that Seydlitz is so damaged and so many issues with her protection and protection of magazines and the ammo handling store procedures, that these things she almost does blow up. If it hadn't been for this battle and her getting home one piece, the Germans wouldn't have rectified it for the High Seas Fleet by the time of the Battle of Jutland. Well, the odds are she gets sunk. And the thing is, if the Germans lose just one battle cruiser as well as the Blucher in this fight, that's a big loss for them. And if they lose more, because maybe they focus their fire on one of the Tiger Cubs rather than Tiger. If the British end up losing a Tiger Cub in the fight, they're not going to be happy. But if they lose one of those, in exchange they get maybe 2 of the German battle cruisers and Blucher, they'd be happy for it. In aggregate. And there's a very real possibility of that happening, because we're adding in between 4 and 6 extra heavy ships into this fight. Yes, they're not battle cruisers. Please note, I'm not claiming they are. But they are the equivalents of Blucher. And she's there, and she's counted. And back him up with the destroyers, back him up with the fast light cruisers, and have them supporting the battle cruisers, and suddenly this is a nasty fight. Because you can match the 3 battle cruisers with Tiger, Lion, and Princess Royal. They can match in against them. Not necessarily as well, because the German ones are built slightly more subdivisions, slightly more armor coverage. They are slightly more second-line battleships in a way than they are battle cruisers, because they have to be because of the German situation. And they've always been more battle cruiser orientated, one word, than battle cruiser, 2 word. But yeah, they're still viable ships. They're still able to fight them. They've got a punch. They've got 13.5-inch guns. In contrast, only the Flinger has 12-inch guns. The rest of them, Moltke and Seydlitz, both have 11-inch guns. They are good guns. They're good 11-inch guns. But the thing is, they can match in against them. And with them mostly having between 3.9 inches and 11.8 inches of armor, 11 inches of armor, in certain places and in covering certain areas, 9.2-inch guns are still going to wreak havoc if they get close enough. And the engagement ranges of the Battle of Dogger Bank, they are definitely close enough. They are less than 20,000 yards. They're within range of those guns. At certain points, they get down to as close as 15, even closer than that, 1,000 yards. They are well within range of the 9.2-inch guns. Rate of fire of 9.2-inch guns is going to be horrific. Even if they're just firing high explosive and setting fire to the decks and the superstructure of them, they're going to cause trouble. There's a lot of areas which aren't armored on a ship which are critical. Which can't be armored. So yes. And there's the other option that if Blucher stops, instead of the battle cruisers, as said, going out, even if BT does suggest to give his instructions and is managed to mangle up, engage the enemy more closely to keep nearer to the enemy. That was the closest equivalent he could make of the signals. Yeah. The thing is, there'll be Craddock there. There'll be other senior officers there, and Craddock's now won a battle solo. The thing is, if you've got that behind you, you are more able to take leeway. It's sometimes called the Nelson touch, but if you've got enough attaboys behind you, you can run the risk of absolutely completely mucking up a couple of times. So yeah, the Battle of Dogger Bank is going to be different. What the German losses going to be? They're still going to lose the battle. They're going to still lose Blucher. I have seen no chance of Blucher surviving any kind of action like that. But I think Seydlitz, and I would say out of the two of them, probably Moltke over De Flinger. Because De Flinger can do 26.5 knots, whereas Moltke can do 25.5 knots. So if either of them is going to actually get away, it's going to be De Flinger. But there isn't much chance of her getting away. Admittedly, they've only got a 1.5 knot advantage in speed over her, rather than 2.5 knots over Moltke. But the real problem that comes in this whole battle and in this whole scenario is that sitting aboard Seydlitz is hipper. So the Germans could lose von Spee and Seydlitz with Hipper aboard in a very tight period of time. Within 3 months, they could lose 2 of their most experienced and best vice admirals. And that's a problem for them, because they haven't got a lot of senior officers who are good at cruiser warfare. And they've just lost their 2 best ones. That's going to have an impact on the High Seas Fleet operations. That's going to have effect, especially if they lose this many ships. Let's be honest, losing the Blucher is bad, but they didn't lose the Seydlitz because of an officer saving them from exploding, and that gives them a chance to learn information and recover their fleet. In this scenario, there's so many more shells flying around, so much more firepower going on. I think Seydlitz gets sunk. And I'm fairly certain Moltke doesn't get away. And because of the way their fleet's action, there is even half of me which would like to say De Flinger doesn't get away. I've run the scenario on a computer a fair number of times with these ships in operation. And so far, the De Flinger ship gets away around about 40% of the time. Now, the British losses run from, in that 60% of the time where it doesn't get away, run from two of the cruisers, the frigates, sort of the Tiger Cubs, to two of the Tiger Cubs and a battle cruiser. Usually, for some reason, the Princess Royal one, simulated that, not the Lion simulator. It's so annoying. BT keeps surviving no matter what I rig it with. Anyway. Of course, I'd never try and rig any of these battles, but I did... For the purposes of historical investigation, I want to see what it would take for BT to die in this battle, and... Basically, I had to abandon him and leave him surrounded by the entire enemy fleet, apparently, it seems, with his luck. Even in a logarithmic luck, digital luck still holds true. It's quite disturbing. But no, if the Germans lose these ships, that's going to change them. They're not going to have the information they need to reform their handling procedures. The British might have an experience which causes them to reform their handling procedures. There might be, one of these ships might get back with severe damage and look at it and go, oh, yeah, this is what we need to do. Or it might be a case of, we've had a lot of damage on our battle cruisers. And there is the other option here. It's always an interesting option, usually at times when it does end up being a total victory, is that the Germans sort of get caught out of contact because they run into the fast group of the BT's force racing ahead. They are running away from them, and they run into the slow group who've moved into an intercept position. And that's usually when you get a total annihilation of the German force. Because there's something going on. And the scenario goes really badly for them. As it understandably would. This is basically taking the British already advantage in numbers, in quantity, thanks to infrastructure and the amount they've been able to produce, and exacerbating it. By giving them ships which, whilst they do not equal a battle cruiser, if you want to guaranteed beat one, you need to one-on-one engage with a battle cruiser. And you can't do that in a scenario where there's other enemy battle cruisers engaging you. It's really annoying. So then we have the wider war. And if you've had this happen at Battle of the Dogger Bank, and you've got more coming through, and I don't see these ships getting paused... Well, definitely not Batch 2. Batch 3, maybe, but Batch 2 I don't see getting paused. I can see that some of them getting involved in Gallipoli. And I can see them being a very sensible asset to leave there with the Lord Nelsons, a couple with Lord Nelsons, for if the Goeben and the Breslau break out. Because they can catch them. They can catch a Goeben. After all, Goeben is a Mach class. Top speed, if everything's all good, of 25.5 knots, design top speed. Can possibly push a little harder when everything's good, all good and in good condition, but if things are not in good condition, not supplied with good coal, not supplied with all the things she needs to really get the best out of her Parsons, that's British-built Parsons turbines... Oh, that's a problem. And again, they have a lot of 11-inch guns. A very good collection. But if you have a couple of these vessels, and their job is to slow it down, hold it down long enough for Lord Nelson to catch up with it, that's a bad situation. Now, of course, during the actual Gallipoli fight itself, Queen Elizabeth will send out there as flagship. And again, these vessels with good gunnery control, the ability to get closer inshore than a battleship, and you might well be able prepared to risk them slightly more than you would a battleship, although probably not as much as you're prepared to risk a Royal Sovereign style ship, i.e. a pre-Dreadnought. There could be some interesting fire control going on there. It's unlikely to change the course of Gallipoli, because, let's be honest, that's stuffed up at the strategic level. That's absolutely mucked up at that level. There is literally no amount of tactical force you can legitimately employ short of, and I have mentioned this before, of filling and sealing the forward and outer sections of a load of Royal Sovereign style battleships with cork, and basically fitting massive bulges to them as well, and then ramming them through the minefield in front of things to get Queen Elizabeth and whatever force you have still surviving to sit off Constantinople, aka Istanbul. The reason you do that is if you're being sensible. That's the easiest way to win the battle. And if you can do that and also have a couple of far ships loaded with troops behind you that you can quickly offload once you get there, you will probably capture the port, as in Porte, i.e. the royal cabinet of the Ottoman Empire, and probably have the ability to dictate peace terms to them, or their terms of surrender. However, I doubt anyone's going to do that. I doubt anything's going to change much other than some interesting firepower and possibly the Australian Navy having their cruiser turning up and leading the fight. Because you wouldn't want to take their battle cruiser. You're not going to take a battle cruiser to do this sort of fighting. It just not. It's a waste of a very good unit. Practically, it's a waste of Queen Elizabeth. But you need a flagship of a certain size and status there, especially if you want to scare the bejesus out of the capital city if you arrive next to it with a fleet. But the 9.2-inch cruiser could be there. And that could form a very interesting relationship for the Australian Navy with the Australian Army. Especially if, let's say, that cruiser is the vessel which evacuates the last of the diggers from Gallipoli. It recovers them. The Australian Navy brings them home. Powerful nation building stuff could be going on with these ships. Powerful nation building. But the fact is, with Von Spey defeated as quickly as he was, with the ability to dispatch these vessels in 1s and 2s places where you need to, whilst keeping a concentrated group back in the UK to support the ground fleet, you're going to have 12. Probably available by about late 1915. And maybe heading on to 18 by 1916, but possibly not. It's going to depend on how things have gone. You might well have a scenario where you have 4 sitting with the battlecruiser fleet, 4 with the ground fleet, but I doubt it. Because if you have them with the ground fleet, they give the ground fleet a great fast wing. Very useful, but honestly, you're probably going to want to have more firepower with the battlecruiser force, especially as a way to keep an eye on them and to strengthen their high-speed advantage. Especially when you've annihilated the German advantage. And again, let's think about this. Germany doesn't have a lot of battlecruisers. They've lost Goeben in Turkey. It's no longer any use. Okay, it's not going to be part of any major fleet action. It's gone. It's there. It's gone as it could be. Dogger Bank, as said, I could write off all 3, but I've been nice. And I've gone with the lower percentage chance, but I've said the Flingers got away. I said they've exercised some sensible thinking and have got away. But they've still lost Seydlitz and Moltke, as well as Blucher. And once you start going through their ships, that leaves them with Von der Tann, which can do 27 knots. Very nice. 27.75 knots was actually what they found she could do when she was fully caught up with great quality coal and was allowed to really stretch her muscles. They've no longer got any of the Moltke class left. 1 sunk, 1 lost to 1 sitting in the Ottomans. They've lost Seydlitz, and the Flinger will have been damaged. She just will have been. Let's be honest, there's no way she's getting out of that fight without being severely damaged. So, their theoretical operating group in 1916 probably, is going to be the repaired Flinger, the Lutzow, which commissions in August 1915, and the Von der Tann. They've got 3 battle cruisers, of which the fastest of those is the Von der Tann, with Lutzow actually being slower than the Flinger herself. Her posted speed is 26.4 knots. And that leads us into the Battle of Jutland. Now, the thing about modern battles, in fact any battle this period, is what matters is communication. What matters is the level of information going back. And we make a big thing in this battle of the fact that good enough messages, the light cruiser squadron commanders, get through and tell Jellicoe pretty much what's going on. And what important ones allow Jellicoe to deploy to squash the T of the Germans. Well, for starters, how the Germans deploy this is going to be different. If they are deploying as historically they did, well, they're already at a massive disadvantage. As historically, they had 5 battle cruisers for this fight, plus second scouting group, of course. And now they've got 3. They've not got Hipper to lead them, so they've had to find another admiral to be in charge. They have not, therefore, they've not got someone with the same experience as Hipper, the same knowledge of Hipper of cruiser warfare. They've still probably got the Deutschland class with them, which are nice and slow. And the Royal Navy, in contrast, has Tiger, has Queen Mary, has the Lion class, and has the backing of, you know, the Infatigables, Invincibles, and all these frigates, these Tiger Cubs. Suddenly the fast wings of the Grand Fleet and the Battlecruiser fleet look far stronger. The Battlecruiser fleet looks a lot stronger. Yes, they still probably have had to have the Queen Elizabeth, and probably due to the gunnery requirements of the area they've been working in the 4S3, they have probably still had the gunnery degradation they have historically had, and still do swapping over and got the Invincibles for Battlecruiser Squadron up with the Grand Fleet for gunnery training. All likely. But, saying all that, you've now got the fact that 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron is probably working with 2nd Frigate Squadron, let's call them, and 1st and 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, along with 5th Battle Squadron, are going to have 1st Frigate Squadron with them. That's going to give them a firepower boost, isn't it? That's going to give them a speed boost as well, because that means they have between 8 and 10 ships which can all do 27.5 knots or higher. Because Queen Mary and Tiger are both together in this force. Now, what does that mean again? Well, I think it means again you probably still have a fast group and a slow group basically occur in the Battlecruiser fleet. Because again, whilst Beatty and Craddock are slightly different personalities, they're both quite happy to charge at the enemy. They're both quite capable of charging at the enemy. And in the case of the Germans, this could be a problem for them, because Hipper's quite smart and quick and on the ball, and is able to turn around quite quickly and head back towards the High Seas Fleet. If the commander who's replaced them is not as quick on the uptake, is not as available, and not as rapid to go, frigate, we need to get out of here, you could see it as, rather than the Battle of Jutland, where you have a chase and a chase and a chase to the south and a chase to the north, and then this engagement, it could turn into another Battle of the Dogger Bank. It could literally turn into, oh, we've run into a lot of battle cruisers. we've run into a lot of guns, we are grossly outnumbered. And that's if the Germans do come out. I think they're probably going to come out. And I think probably what happens is the Germans suffer again in this battle. Now, historically, Seydlitz gets into trouble even in this battle. Seydlitz has a habit of getting into very severe trouble. After the Battle of Jutland, there's a famous picture of her. She has basically come home by strength of will of her crew alone. That is the only thing keeping her just this side of being underwater and becoming a wreck. In this scenario, they don't have Seydlitz. They don't have Moltke to support them, to take hits. It's von der Tann, which by this point, some are putting down to a speed of 24.8 knots, her design speed, rather than her top speed in testing. And if they are really going along limited to roughly 24 knots, with so little force and such an increased force on the British side, it's hard to see the German scouting group not getting mauled. And then the question becomes, does Scheer risk it? If he hears the scouting groups getting mauled, maybe he comes to protect them. Possibly does. Try and save them. More than likely comes up. But does he give chase afterwards? If he's already got severely damaged battle cruisers, he's not got Hipper, a leader who he trusts to lead those ships. He's got someone who probably he has respect for, but they're not going to have the same relationship, not that quickly. Even after even a little over a year later. A year and a half later. What's going to happen? I myself think Scheer withdraws at that point. I don't think he chases them. I know the entire German battle plan is get a section of the Royal Navy alone and smash them. But in this scenario, he might well believe that he's come across a force of, again, because they're going to look like they're going to look like battle cruisers or dreadnoughts. He could think that some of the Tigers are dreadnoughts. So you've got 5th Battle Squadron, you've got the Tiger Cubs, you've got all the battle cruisers involved in this point. He could think he's come across a force which is easily half his own. Because the scary thing of the Battle of Jutland, if you're looking at it from a pure numbers perspective, is that the Royal Navy Dreadnought battleships alone outnumber the combined total of German Dreadnoughts, pre-Dreadnoughts, that is Royal Sovereign style battleships, and battle cruisers at the battle as they were historically. In this scenario, they've already lost two of those battle cruisers in an earlier battle. So they're already down 2 on that. In which case, they're bringing a total force of 25 ships. The Royal Navy has 28 dreadnoughts and 9 battle cruisers. Plus, traditionally, the Royal Navy also brings 8 armoured cruisers. And perhaps 12 frigates. Perhaps 10 frigates. It's going to depend on damages, losses, and what was necessarily reconstructed in time. That's not good. It exacerbates things. And it means that if he's looking at the battlecruiser fleet, he could well be perceiving it as a force which is as strong, if not stronger than him. In which case he's going to withdraw. Because the requirement is they find a section of the Royal Navy which is smaller than them, destroy it, then withdraw, and keep doing that until they've destroyed enough of the Royal Navy they can beat it entirely. By the way, it's the same same strategy, broadly speaking, as the Japanese had for World War II. Trick the Americans down to the level which they could fight a decisive battle and win. It's not a bad strategy. It's just dependent to extent on your enemy playing ball. The problem also, though, is going to be, does he get away with it? Yes, they're probably going to run into himself, but if Craddock is sending back reports as he is wont to do, if he hasn't been trained out of that, and I doubt he would have been, I think probably Jellicoe will have been encouraging it dramatically, then Jellicoe could well have had the information about what's going on and could be running still quite hard south to find them. In which case, you might have the slower German fleet, because overall it is slower, its speed being dictated by the 19 and 18 knots maximum of their Royal Sovereign style pre-Dreadnought battleships. Mostly the Deutschland class and the Hessen. Bringing the Hessen along is really, really inexcusable, but there's also the Nassau class can only do 19 knots, and when you consider the Royal Navy's fleet is all 21 knots and higher in terms of their ships, if they are coming down fast enough, and if you've got the information, they might also get the Harwich force to, instead of waiting somewhere around about there, to actually come up and engage as well. The British could turn it into a full-on meeting engagement. And again, I don't expect the British to win such a battle without losses. That's never going to happen. But the sheer overwhelming quantity they'll be bringing to the fight, along with their level of training, their level of gunnery drill, their level of practice they've been doing, especially with the Grand Fleet, because the closest you've got to Lee in World War I is Jellicoe. The closest you've got to Jellicoe in World War II is Lee from the gunnery perspective and Cunningham from the strategy perspective, in terms of how they act. So think about that one. Imagine what someone who's very close to Lee, as in Ching Lee, the American gunnery admiral who was absolutely amazing at gunnery and fire control. Imagine what that kind of personality does when he's got a fleet trapped in a space where they haven't got much else to do but gunnery practice and gunnery drill every day. The Grand Fleet are good at hitting their targets. They really are good. You see this by the damage totals in the Battle of Jutland. If the shells had worked better, or they'd had another engagement, the engagement had gone on longer, the Germans hadn't been able to duck away, etc., the battle could have been very different. The battle could have been very, very different. And in this scenario, you don't possibly have the battle cruisers to throw away, especially if they've been damaged in the earlier fight. Under that scenario, Shear's probably trying to herd them home, protect them home, stop the battlecruiser fleet from annihilating them, to try and get them home so you can use them another day. And it's a race then between whether he can get to the safety of the minefields or the Grand Fleet can catch him first. And if the Grand Fleet catches him in such a situation, it's not going to be a walkover, it's not going to be a turkey shoot, but it is going to be a battle of annihilation, where the Royal Navy is going to be prepared to accept pretty much anything as long as they wipe out the High Seas Fleet. You don't want to lose any ships. They're going to do their damnedest not to lose any ships, but they will accept losing ships if it means they can wipe out the German High Seas Fleet. And if they do that, then things can become very different indeed. If they don't do it, if they just have mauled the first scouting group's remnants and maybe they've lost another ship or maybe they've got mauled back damaged, then I see it playing out much as it did historically, where the Germans are hiding in harbour and the British are working out how to deal with them, how to attack them. It might even cause a more quick appreciation of aircraft design. Again, one of the interesting things in this scenario to me is A, how does it affect the design of HMS Hermes, and how quickly does Hermes get built? Because if you haven't got the things to play around with Furious, and I doubt you'll be playing around with only the 9.2-inch gunships, and you haven't got Courageous and Glorious, it might be Hermes-style aircraft carriers are ordered earlier, and they might well be slightly bigger, because if they are, let's say, to save time and money, they have their hull based on these ships. Well, for starters, they'll be faster at 28 knots. They'll be bigger because Hermes was 11,000 tons in standard, 14,000 tons in deep load. So with a tonnage displacement of 12 to 15, or between 12 and 18,000, let's split the difference in the middle and go 15,000 tons to work from. She's probably going to be a longer, bigger ship. You're probably talking about a 30 to 40 aircraft capacity. And faster, as said. They could have built a couple of them. They could have even built more, and be using them to launch Sopwith Cuckoo strikes on the German fleet in Wilhelmshaven. Because again, if you consider it from the security perspective of launching a fleet, you can rush for, if they're able to do 28 knots, which you know can outpace the Germans, and you've got all these cruisers which can do 28 knots and outpace the Germans, and you've got some battle cruisers that can do 28 knots and outpace the Germans, you've got some destroyers which can outpace the Germans, and all these things outpace the Germans, you can dash in, launch a strike, and run away. Or withdraw onto the rest of the Grand Fleet, hoping they'll come out. What does a strike of 60 Sopwith Cuckoos achieve? Well, honestly, the torpedoes, if I borrow the floppy torpedo I have up here from the AUKUS. She's a tough thing, is AUKUS. World of Warships fluffy torpedo. So, the British, to get this to work in World War II, not only do the lightning and the buoyancy work and the longer fins, which pretty much everyone else does, they also do a tension cable. Now, they're beginning to develop these when they're working on them with the Sopwith Cuckoo. And the reason they want the tension cable and everything else is they want the torpedo to belly flop, because if it belly flops rather than dives, it goes the shallowest, runs truest, and is best for attacking in a harbour, because if it dives in, most of the time it's going to hit the bottom of the harbour. Wilhelmshaven is quite deep, though. So the odds are, especially with the way they're only dropping the Sopwith Cuckoos and torpedoes they're going to be using, you're probably looking, if they're dropping 60 torpedoes, about 20 will run. About a third. The trouble for the Germans is going to be that Wilhelmshaven is considered a safe haven, so they're not keeping their torpedo nets up. It's considered a space where they are safe and they're able to run ashore, and a lot of the crew are going to be ashore because the Germans don't have their ships designed to be as habitable to the same degree as the British, because they're not living on them. In which case, there's not going to be as much crew aboard the ships, and they're going to have a lot of doors open because, again, they're safe, they're in harbour, it makes things easier to communicate, it allows air to circulate, all sorts of things. Let's say 15 of those torpedoes hit. You could lose a lot of ships. And that's one scenario for this discussion, because the other scenario, of course, is they do have the fight. They do have that battle of attrition. The British are going to lose ships. Who knows? Maybe a third of the fleet the Royal Navy will lose. But the High Seas Fleet gets annihilated. The British will return back. Victorious heroes. They've suffered a lot, but they've got full command of the North Sea. They've got more ships coming out of construction. They're building more. Yes, they've lost a third of ships. Yes, they've had a horrendous loss of life. What do they do next? Force the Baltic. It's the obvious thing to do. Use your Tiger Cubs and every other ship you can get available in a suitable amount of time. Force the Baltic. Block off German imports through the Baltic. Bombard the Baltic coast. Maybe even land some troops there. Run convoys through to St. Petersburg. It doesn't need to be much, but anything you can run through to St. Petersburg is going to be a massive, massive propaganda win for whichever government's there by the time you turn up. What does this do? Well, if Germany's sensible at this point in the war, it forces them to sue for peace. And it forces the rest of the tripartite, Austro-Hungarian, etc., the entire side to sue for peace. Because if Germany's suing for peace, there ain't any chance of the others getting out of it. If it wins, if they do end up getting peace through that, then A, the Royal Navy is going to be considered the winners of the war. B, the Germans don't have the stabbed in the back theory about the politicians back home. It's going to be a case of, the army was never defeated. No, but the Navy was annihilated. The Navy was annihilated to a man. The lesson they might take from that is, do not challenge the Royal Navy at sea. Do not challenge the British in a naval war. You can always hope, but I doubt they will do. Whatever happens in that scenario is war ends sooner. War could end as soon as December 1916, probably. In which case, it's a long time before the Americans enter the war. It's a long time before the British have run up the massive debts they historically do in World War I, because if you look at the years of debt they've taken, basically they don't run out of money until they don't really start getting into debt till 1917 in a seriously massive way. It's considered a really weird thing, but it's actually, when you look at it, the British burn through their reserves in 14-15 in terms of their financial reserves. They have got other stuff they're able to basically sell off and pawn, is basically what funds 16 and into 17, and then it's debt 17 and 18, and that's when the debt massively spikes, and the debt post-war to try and recover from things. So you don't have that. You also don't necessarily have the losses of life you historically have in the great big battles in 16, 17, 18, and the rest of the war. You have, of course, lost a lot of the naval life. There's going to be a lot of officers, a lot of names who we traditionally see in World War II will probably have gone. If you've lost a third of the fleet in such a battle, and that's me saying sunk. There's also going to be ships which are horrendously damaged. But a third of the fleet lost. Yeah. It's going to be a nightmare to recover from. But they're going to be in a position to recover from it. Those are your two scenarios. Either Scheer gets his force away, and manages to get behind the minefield, in which case we might see development of naval aviation more rapidly than it was historically, and that come out of it. Or we have a battle of annihilation, which, along with forcing the Baltic, would cement the Royal Navy as the winners of World War One. It would. Because what would your argument be? It was the battles ashore which won the war. Yes, they held the German army and stopped them taking France. It did, and it was critical. But the Royal Navy lost a third of its strength, annihilating the German fleet, and then turned that within a couple of months into a blockade in the Baltic, which stopped the Germans doing anything. And let's be honest, a real blockading strength is going to be the Royal Navy submarines, which they'll get in there and support, and probably running from various parts of Russia, etc. But the thing is, the surface fleet getting in there is going to be the big thing, which is going to symbolize it. And it's not as if naval aviation is at the point at which it's regularly sinking ships for both sides, enough that that's going to hold the British out of it. And the minefields in the Baltic, well, they're patchy because of the neutrals. And if you haven't got the high seas fleet as a threat to come out and attack Britain, so ground fleet can go round Denmark. Yeah. They can do this. They can do this. With that all being said, what about post-war world? Well, for starters, Hawkins class ain't coming about. No, this sounds terrible, but in a post-war world, the Hawkins class really don't make sense. The Hawkins class have 7.5-inch guns. So what they will come about as, they will either be the post-war batch of 9.2-inch gun cruisers, or they won't come about. And the reason I say this is because if you have these big, fast cruiser rolls, frigates, whatever you want to call them, operating, there is no justification for spending your money on that, because they can easily beat that, and they're not much more expensive than it. And if you want the mass, you're going to go for the C's, the D's, the E-class cruisers, the light cruisers. It's also going to have an effect on if there's any treaties. I'm sorry, if war ends in 1916, there is no naval treaty. There is no, and the Americans didn't get involved in the war. There's no chance they're getting a Washington Naval Treaty. They're not getting to be part of the Treaty of Versailles, which possibly makes it even more harsh on the Germans. And there's no, we want a Washington Naval Treaty. Why? The Royal Navy just won World War I for us. Why are we doing that? Just wouldn't happen. And the thing is, this force, it's tipped the scales enough in a cumulative fashion. As I try to explain, a lot of long world wars and world war conflicts, they are cumulative. So you win enough early battles, you degrade the enemy force enough that you have an overwhelming advantage when you get to later. Taking out 2 battle cruisers at Doggle Bank doesn't sound like a lot of force. It isn't. But you take out 2, that is going to fundamentally alter first scouting group and any Battle of Jutland-like scenario. For the weaker. Because that's taking away 40% of their fighting strength. And you already had a larger force to begin with, and then you have even more force available at the Battle of Jutland. Oh, frigate. They are just in trouble at that point. And, okay, let's say the war, so, Washington treaties don't happen, and it's just a continuation of naval policy, and the world's so fundamentally different that, frankly, no one can really predict it. But if the Germans do manage to retreat back in, the war does carry on. It could carry. Well, there will be airstrikes. I said I'm fairly certain the airstrikes policy is going to change because you're going to have to build ships. The quickest hull you've got available that you've got as designs for, and you've got lots of people used to building them, are going to be these ships that are suitable for for a carrier. So that's what's going to be done. If you have that as a scenario, Okay, war goes on long enough, the Americans probably get involved because the Germans probably carry on as they do historically. The Kaiser's not going to get any smarter. In which case, there could be a Washington Naval Treaty. But that Washington Naval Treaty is now going to take an account of A, there are, let's call them frigates. I have for several points in this video, and I'm going to continue doing it. Up to 20,000 tons with 9.2-inch guns. Maybe you make it as up to 20,000 tons and 10-inch guns, because they do like round numbers up above. But you've got to factor those in, and lots of people are going to want them post-war. Do you put a treaty limit on those, or do you make those? Do they take the historical point of ships below this level are not limited by the treaty? We're only limiting capital ships. Because if you take that as your policy, good luck getting through a 35,000 ton limit on capital ships. Because if you said you can build as many 20,000 ton vessels as you want, there is no advantage in a 35,000 ton capital ship over the sheer quantity of 20,000 ton ships you can pump out. Even if they can carry bigger guns. Because you can literally overwhelm them with numbers if you're prepared to commit your infrastructure to it. So you're talking about a 45,000 ton capital ship limit. And you've got a carrier tonnage limit as well. And again, if you've made 20,000 tons your limitation, well then carriers like Hermes, etc. are not going to count at all. So I think you probably end up with a scenario whereby they go, right, ships 10,000 tons and below, you can build as many of them as you like. They're allowed to be armed with guns, let's say, up to 6 inches. They might even make it 7 inches. Something like that. And then they'll go, right then, anything over 7-inch guns up to 10 inches, they're allowed to be up to 20,000 tons. You then have a limitation of those. And you then have a limitations placed on above other things as well. And if you've got the limitation of 20,000 ton ships, you're only allowed so many of those. You're going to be allowed so many, probably 40,000 ton capital ships, which means I think you'd probably go for a 30,000 ton limit on your carrier. And I think the difference is going to be the numbers of ships again. Because I don't see you getting to go... We're going to give you multiples of 5s in this scenario. And the reason I say that is because the British have already got at least 12 of these at least 12, maybe 18 across the sort of across the empire, across the Dominion. So the Britain's probably going to accept something like 20 as the limitation. They would accept 20, with grounds that they can replace theirs at any point they want because they're all in the experimental before the treaty cutoff. So they can change, they can do theirs whenever they want. America gets 20. If that's your baseline number, you're probably going to end up having to agree 10 carriers. You might get 15 capital ships, but it's going to be 15 of 40,000 tons, which is 600,000 tons allocation, not 525,000 tons. So that's 75,000 tons more difference. There's more construction available, as far as the British and Americans are concerned. For the Japanese, you might well go, right then, we will allow you free to 60% for the capital ships and the carriers, but we'll allow you to 70% for the frigates. So you will be allowed 14 frigates, to Britain and America each having 20. You will be allowed 6 carriers, to Britain and America each having 10. Because that's probably the number the British will accept if they've been using them. And maybe they say less, but I think it would be about 10. And especially where the odds are the British looking at the carriers as much as reconnaissance assets and information assets, which they've been using them for the ground fleet and battlecruiser fleet during the war, as they are as strike assets. And they were looking historically at them as counter-surface radar tools. So, yeah, 10 is where I think they settle on. And if they've got the 15 battleships, well, yeah, then Japan's allowed 9. But also under this scenario, even if it's his 15, and it's 40,000 ton limit, if you consider the historical tonnage the Royal Navy took up, and the historical tonnage they then allocate to building new ships, they are probably getting 3 of the Nelrod class, of whatever the Nelrod class is in this scenario. And you don't have to do much to an F3 style design with more shafts and boilers, armor, etc. With 16-inch guns, that sort of layout, sort of slightly longer layout, slightly narrower beam, but similar armor levels, etc. And probably probably 16-inch guns to get a 28-knot fast battleship. You're probably talking about the British putting 37,000 tons to it. An extra 3,500 tons on the Nelrods, which they can afford to in this scenario. They're going to have tonnage to spare. The interesting thing is going to be the building race is going to be 9.2-inch or up to 10-inch armed cruisers, and I could see the Americans and Japanese both going, well, 10 inches is the maximum, so we're going to go for that. And then quickly remembering, hang on, 10-inch requires basically capital ship grade turret infrastructure on the ships because of the weight of the shells. 9.2-inch is the upper limit for cruiser grade infrastructure. Anything above that is going to weigh a lot more. And if you're dealing with a weight limit, I think the 9.2-inch gun is going to be the sweet spot. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Americans and the Japanese first try with some 10-inch ships and then go, these are not necessarily the best idea. While the British keep to 9.2-inch. That would be my strong suspicion as to what would happen. A very strong suspicion. So what's the summary? Well, I asked the question the other day, what was the third rate in various periods of history? And the interesting answer, I think, for First World War is, I don't really see there being a vessel which fills the role of the third rate, that traditional vessel of the fleet. This would have been it. And it's not a ship which I don't see happening. I see if peace had continued, I'm very certain they would have been ordered. Maybe not 1914, but certainly 1915. Because there is that realization. A, the old armoured cruisers need to go. B, and are going to be going soon. B, you don't want to send out the Royal Sovereign style pre-Dreadnoughts to go and do those jobs because they're going. You need something to take on the station cruiser presence. The heavy cruiser, the big cruiser. And heavy cruiser as a phraseology doesn't make sense in a world with battle cruisers in them because they're not the heaviest cruiser. So yeah, I can see them happening anyway. So in many ways we moved them earlier than what they would have naturally occurred. What's their value? Their value is simple. They're going to be ships which are large enough and powerful enough that the world has to take notice of them. They're going to be able to support things. They're going to provide the volume, the mass, the quantity for operations. And the reason they weren't there is, as I said, my strong suspicion is it was decided that, frankly, that was pushing the politics too far. It's not a finance thing. They could get the money out of the government. The government didn't want to, it always doesn't want to spend money on the Navy, but the government in the run up to World War One is kind of over a barrel where the Navy's concerned. The Navy political machine is second to none in the British Armed Forces. The Navy has such a strong heritage, and the British Empire is so associated with the Navy, and Britain's position in the world is so associated with the Navy at this point, that if the Navy says we really need this, there is not much grounds for the government to be able to resist. You know, the classic example is, again, the We Want 8 campaign, where the Royal Navy wanted 6, the Treasury wanted them to have 4, they compromised on a deal they would get 4 and 4 more if, you know, situation happened, and oh by golly, the situation happened, so they got 8. And you sit there and go, well, did the Treasury didn't win that, because the Treasury did not want any codicil of you'll get 4 more. They didn't want it. They conceded it, and they ended up almost immediately going, yes, you're getting the 8. Almost immediately. It's very expensive for them. Oh, by the way, and a 6th Queen Elizabeth class, the Agincourt. So basically, the Royal Navy is building 5 Queen Elizabeths and 4 R's, and very quickly they are suddenly building 6 Queen Elizabeths and 8 R's. So they go from 9 ships under construction to 14 of that 15-inch gun generation. Theoretically, Agincourt being a 15-inch gun ship. As said, I've put in a video, I'm fairly certain she was an 18-inch gun ship, and I've got a whole video explaining why I think she was, but we'll leave that to one side. It's not much more in terms of infrastructure, it's not much more in terms of cost or personnel, but it adds something to the forces. It adds, critically where they need fast forces, it adds things in. It stops losses at Coronel. Is it going to save Aboukir, Cressy and Hogue? No. They're probably still lost to a submarine. Which means the Royal Navy is probably going to still be as paranoid as ever over submarines. But interestingly enough, they are going to have some armoured cruisers, the frigate cruisers are probably going to, like Tiger, be fairly well designed for dealing with torpedo hits, thanks to their subdivision and organisation internally. So they're going to be fairly survivable against the threat. In a world where these exist, the Deutschland class do not make a lot of sense. Post-World War II. You know, post-World War I in the 1920s and 30s. Deutschland class do not make a lot of sense. Oh, great, we've got 6 11-inch guns in 2 triple turrets. Yay! By that point, on the tonnage available, the Royal Navy could have, well, probably has still got 8 9.2-inch guns. We've got 6 11-inch. We've got 8 9.2-inch. Yes, you've got a slight advantage there. Very good 11-inch guns. But there are 20 of us in the service of the Royal Navy. Or, and this is the real point, if you've got 400,000 tons allocated to it and you only need 18,000 tons to produce a perfectly adequate one in the Royal Navy's attention, which might have 9 9.2-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, they could have built 22 of them. They could have 22 of them in service by the time World War II comes around. The world starts to shrink very quickly under these circumstances. Very, very quickly. And the quicker you're able to deal with enemy surface raiders, the quicker you're able to concentrate on what you need to do. And if we add on to the fact that if you have the tonnage limitation is set at 40,000 tons for battleships, then, well, I do not see the King George V's coming out with anything less than 12 14-inch guns. I don't see that as a likely scenario. But I also see the fact that there's going to be 3 Nell rods, which are going to be F3 style with the C turret superfiring rather than B turret, and able at 28 knots plus. Don't get me started on the Americans and Japanese construction. Because the Japanese probably go with, yeah, we'll fit them with a 10-inch gun, but we can fit them with a 12-inch gun later. Design. If we want to. Because that makes sense of having that mechanism. Of having the capital ship level mechanism you need infrastructure in. But they're going to be 6-gun ships. Because if they try and make out if they try and get through 8-gun ships, even with 10-inch guns, the Royal Navy is going to be looking and going, we all know you're cheating. The Lexington class could be very different for building construction on, and the Admiral class could be very different in this scenario. The Admiral class are probably still battle cruisers, but there is an honest option here that if there is a scenario whereby World War I goes on for longer, and you do have a naval treaty, that if they haven't been got rid of, or still on the stocks, they're the conversions, not courageous and glorious, as they won't exist. Or, well, if they do exist, they could well be 9.2-inch gun cruisers, because the names could have been picked for them. It's a very sensible design, it's a very simple design, and a simple option to go with, and it's a natural evolution of the situation you have. As I said at the beginning, and I will say again now, the ships were getting more expensive. While you had the 12-inch gun Invincibles in service, while you had the Indefatigables in service, while you had all the armoured cruisers in service, it is difficult to justify procuring these ships, because those others can cover the various roles. But once you start to lose those 9.2-inch gun old armoured cruisers, once you start to lose especially the Royal Sovereign style pre-Dreadnoughts, they become more sensible, and they are sensible at this point as well. But I always finish these videos with a question, and this is not going to be a different time. We are, of course, looking at what would have been an eminently sensible procurement for the Royal Navy to do, within its limitations of infrastructure and everything else. I'd like you to think about the Royal Navy, but also the other navies, and think about similar periods of history. And I'd like you to consider what would be an eminently sensible thing they should have done. That they did later, they had the information and reason they should have done it earlier. I'd like you to think about it. I'd also like you to think about, in this world, what do the treaty ships look like? What does Italy build in terms of their equivalent to these cruisers? What does France do? Because if you cannot build, if there's a building holiday on capital ships for pretty much everyone other than the British getting to build their ships, then what do you see? This is going to be the natural area of competition where people are building for national status. What do you see them building? What do you see the Americans building? Do you think they go 10-inch like I do in the first batch and then go, this doesn't make sense, and drop down? Or do they keep persevering with a 10-inch gun and try and make it as good as they possibly can? I'd love to hear your views. I'd love to hear what you think. So, well, I wanted to add another thank you to people who've been contributing to the Calyx Fund and the stuff I've been doing at the moment to flesh out my office and get that good. For those who don't know the story and the history, all my research, as I said earlier in the Shameless book plug, is funded by you. That's how I do my research. How I get to do my historical research and manage to put money towards it and go to archives and do all the research to put these videos. Everything's funded by you and your support. And middle of the year, after we come back from the last Shipshape trip, which is a group I do with Drakenfell, Garrus the Brit, Dr. Dan, who's known as T-Driven Doc, and Dan Colden, who's Boom Boom Dan, he's a chemist. So Medical Dan and we have a Chemist Dan, both of whom are very good with chemicals, and very good at interviewing people. I managed to get pneumonia, and that knocked me out for a good few weeks. I'm getting better. I'm getting back to myself, but it meant when we came down here we found there was a lot more work when we moved house than we were expecting from the surveyor's report and everyone else that had come around. All sorts of interesting things have cropped up that have needed a lot of work. And B, I'm not able to do as much as I'm normally able to do. And when I say stuff cropped up, I'm talking whole doors have been taken and disappeared. It's fun. But leaving that to one side, that meant that I couldn't get my office set up. I couldn't get my books out because I had no shelves to put them on. I'd been planning on building shelves. I no longer had the energy. I didn't really have the energy stamina to do it, and I didn't have the money. Was having to go on other things like doors, etc. Very kindly, you all supported that. You all supported me being able to put money towards getting the Clarke shells. I still need to get the feet. And I need to get the small Clarkes. They're still left. And I have filled up every single shelf I've got. There is not a single empty shelf, and I've still got another odd 40 boxes of books to go. So I probably need to get more Clarkes in time, but that will be in time. That'll be over time. Thank you, everyone. I said thank you for all your support. I couldn't do this without you. I couldn't do this, and I especially couldn't have done this without your support. There's no way. It's moving house. Quickest way to go bankrupt I have yet experienced. I haven't gone bankrupt. Please no, that's just me doing British sarcasm. But I look at my account at the moment and it's currently very, very low. Luckily, I'm getting back into the swing of work things, so I'm starting to write the articles, I'm doing the online teaching, and I'm doing the other work I have which pays my bills normally, so I can put all the money from this channel into research, into funding everything. So, yeah, that's all slowly getting back there, but it's thanks to you I've managed to get through it without going grey or having a lot more stress, and actually have managed to get the office to the point it is now. It's not tidy. It's got a whole load of boxes around it, and it's a whole lot of things out which I would rather not were out and would rather stored away. But it's a lot further along than it would be without you. And so thank you. I wouldn't be where I am without you. Thank you. And what have we got coming up? Well, on this week, on Tuesday, and it should be advertised by the time this has come up, because hopefully the edited one will have been done and all set up and I'll be happy with it. On Tuesday, it's going to be 2 historians. It's going to be a premiere, Patreon premiere, and it's going to be the Royal Navy that could have been with Drakenfell, him and me chatting, and it's going to start off the 2 historian series, which I'm hoping I'm going to get a lot of historians for. I like the idea of interviewing historians and sticking it up on videos and just having chats. And if there's any historians you think I should be talking to in the year of aircraft carriers, who you think I might not have asked, I'm happy to open and do it. I have got some slots which I've got ideas for the Christmas period, but if people want to do it, I will happily chuck them in and record them, because I love doing the chat. I pay the money, so I have the system set up to use for them. I do not run Zoom for the good of my health or because I particularly love Microsoft, but because it's very good for this sort of thing. It's very good for when we record build trumps, which also will hopefully be coming back soon. So, yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, for all that. I hope you're well, and I hope you're looking forward to this. But if there are any historians you could think of that I should be contacting, please tell me. Especially if you know them and you can introduce us by social media or whatever. I said I'm happy to chat with people. I'm happy to chat. This year's the year of aircraft carriers. Next year's the year of leadership. There's plenty of scope for moving around within those 2 things, I think, for people to come and talk and for a wide range of historians to come and chat. My only line is I'm not able to do the 24 hours of work as much as I was doing in the prior to being ill. I'm getting better, but I'm not there yet. So there are sort of restrictions on my timing as well. So the thing is, I might be chatting to people and go, I would really love to do this with you. When can we get our calendars to work out together? That's the question. And I suppose the other criteria I have, because please note, as I've mentioned many times, my little cousins watch this channel, and I am massively outnumbered by my cousins of my age, in that I am the only boy and the rest are decidedly not. They have children, and if my channel teaches the little ones words which they do not deem they should know, which I find really funny considering some of them are children of Royal Marines and some of them are farming children, so in the nicest way, they know words which probably I don't know at certain points. But no, if my channel teaches them words they're not supposed to know, I'm in trouble. So I suppose the criteria is timing, and they have to present their case without teaching my little cousins new words, which will get me into trouble with their parents. Okay? Which I don't think is really an onerous requirement in life. It's like when people do comments on this channel, and that's the only restriction I have on the comments. I let everything else through. I really don't mind. But you can't be teaching my little cousins new words. Because I will get the blame, not you. And I'm outnumbered. A lot. Come from quite a large family, an extended family, which has lots of other people in it who are called cousins, but honestly, they've been friends of the family for multiple generations, but no one's ever married each other, so they're not blood relatives, but they're still called cousins as far as we're concerned. It's a clan is the best way to describe it in British context, because it's certainly not a cult, but it's definitely a clan. It's large, it's massive, and there's only me in here. I will get the blame. Anytime their kids pick up anything off the internet, it's automatically presumed it's going to be my fault, because they've all been watching my channel. And so few of them are in my Discord server. Don't worry, I keep an eye out on that one. There is a reason I'm as quiet as I am normally on the Discord server. It's because I'm watching for my little cousins and what they might be getting up to. I reserve my judgment to jump in if I need to on that occasions. But with that as a criteria, everything else, I'm happy to take any recommendations. I think that's all fair. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and hope you're looking forward to the videos coming up. And Historiathon soon. Which video to explain, which should come out this week.